of the conference, titled Social Transformations and Muslim Traditions. We have three most valuable speakers. We'll go in order in presentations. The first talk will be given by Professor Conway, an assistant professor at the University of North Dakota, titled Little Mosques, No Screen, the Public Service Mandate and Islam on TV.
Well, thank you. I want to begin by thanking the organizers for allowing me to present. I wanted to give you two pieces of context to understand my paper. First of all, I'm a media scholar, and I write about globalization and the media and cultural identity in North America. Increasingly, I found myself writing about religion, and in particular Islam. But I come to it from a media studies perspective, and I wanted to give you that from the outset. I'm writing about a program called Little Mosque on the Prairie, which is a Canadian sitcom that aired on the CBC from 2006 up until about 2 weeks ago. It's a show I'll describe more in a second, but it's one that has captured the interest of a lot of scholars. And I've noticed that most articles about Little Mosque on the Prairie are written by scholars of Islam who present very sophisticated arguments about the religious aspect of the show, and, if you'll forgive me, very naive arguments about the media aspect of the show. I wanted to warn you that I suspect that I'm doing the inverse of that. So if you'll be generous with your feedback, I'll greatly appreciate it. So the second piece of context, Little Mosque on the Prairie ran from 2006 until 2012. It was created by a woman named Zarka Nawaz, who is a feminist Muslim living in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is a rural part of Western Canada. In this show, she had a very keen interest to present a diversity of representations of Muslims. And so one of the things that's remarkable about the show is that it has 6 main Muslim characters who represent a wide range of levels of devoutness, a wide range of approaches, and a wide range of geographic origins. It ran on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation up until about 2 weeks ago. The CBC has the mandate to reflect Canada to Canadians, and it was the mandate that I was interested in when I started this project. So this is part of a chapter in a book that I am in the process of writing about Islam and North American sitcoms. So from 2007 until 2012, in an atmosphere of moral panic about the threat of global terror, Canada's public service broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, aired a gentle half-hour comedy called Little Mosque on the Prairie about Muslims in a fictional small town in Saskatchewan. The show is notable because it was a popular success, and Canada has had very few popular sitcoms. It was also notable because it definitely raised issues of religion, especially Islam, in post-9/11 North America. Little Mosque's multicultural qualities have received a great deal of critical and journalistic attention. The show was created by a feminist Muslim filmmaker, Zarka Nawaz, whose films included a documentary about the consequences for women of increasing conservatism in North American mosques, and a comedy about a struggling writer who tries to garner publicity for her novel by getting someone in her mosque community to issue a fatwa on her. The show also featured Muslim characters from a wide range of cultural backgrounds and with a wide range of political and religious beliefs. These qualities have led scholars such as Sarah Matheson to observe that Little Mosque helped the CBC meet its mandate to, this is a quote from the 1991 Broadcasting Act, to reflect the multicultural and multiracial nature of Canada. It was a mandate that was given by Parliament to the CBC in 1991 in the hope of encouraging a more diverse representation of Canadians. Similarly, the CBC itself has cited Little Mosque as a program that demonstrates the network's commitment to delivering, in its words, arts and entertainment that is as richly varied as the Canadian society itself. Thus, it would appear that multiculturalism mandate has been effective. However, these after-the-fact assessments do not reflect the more complicated genesis of Little Mosque. Instead, as I discuss here, The people involved in the show's production, including its creator Zarka Nawaz and its executive producers Mary Darling and Clark Donnelly, created the show in reaction to a wide range of issues unrelated to the CBC's multiculturalism mandate. Similarly, the mandate's influence was indirect in the decision by Anton Leo, who was the CBC's creative head of television comedy, to bring the show to the attention of the network's programming executives. So what this case study reveals is, one, the limitation of policy as a means to encourage a specific type of programming, but two, and of more interest to people at this conference, it reveals one set of conditions under which the Orient-Occident binary identified by Edward Said in his book covering Islam breaks down. Little Mosque was created by a woman who is both Western and Muslim, and the other many people involved in its production operated in a constantly reflexive manner. They were constantly thinking about how their programming was or was not reflecting the ongoing debates about the relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims in North America. In other words, the show developed in a very different set of circumstances than those that, in Edward Said's words, so far as European interest in alien cultures is concerned, have always been commercial, colonial, or military expansion, conquest, and empire. So what I want to do here, I'm going to go through briefly the factors that were motivating the creator of the program, Zarka Nawaz, the executive directors, in particular Mary Darling, and then the CBC executive who was responsible for greenlighting the program, Anton Leo. So the factors shaping Zarka Nawaz's creation of Little Mosque were both intrinsic, related to identity, and extrinsic, related to global geopolitics. Nawaz's identity as a Muslim and her convictions as a feminist provided an initial impulse, which was shaped in turn by factors deriving from global geopolitical events, as well as her experience in Canada's broadcasting and film industries. Nawaz was trained as a journalist, but turned to filmmaking after moving to Regina, Saskatchewan in the 1990s. She was born in Liverpool, and she grew up in Toronto, and to move to Regina has about 100,000 people, so to go from Cosmopolitan to Toronto to Regina was quite a shift for her. It was at that point that she decided that she would turn to filmmaking because she needed something to do. So in 1996, she made a 5-minute comedy called Barbecue Muslims as part of a summer workshop at the Ontario College of Art. It was about two brothers whose backyard grill explodes, causing their neighbors to think they are terrorists. And it was an indirect statement about the suspicion cast on Muslims after the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. Nawaz recounts watching people laugh when it was screened at the 1996 Toronto International Film Festival and realizing the value of humor for talking about sensitive topics. This, however, was a very serendipitous beginning. So in her words, that's how my career started, by accident. The organizers of the film festival told me later, they said there would be a lot of people who watch a film and say, we got rejected for this, because it wasn't the most technically proficient film. But they said that this was the first indication of someone who was experimenting with comedy and Muslims and terrorism, and they'd never seen anything like this before. Nawaz's next film was Death Threat in 1998, a comedy about the struggling author mentioned in the introduction. After that, she wrote a script for a comedy called Real Terrorists Don't Belly Dance, about a Muslim actor cast as a terrorist intent on blowing up an airplane. But she wrote that right before 9/11, and after 9/11, no producer was going to touch that script. At that point, she was approached by the National Film Board of Canada, which asked her to make a documentary for its Real Diversity competition. So she wrote and directed Me and the Mosque in 2005, in which she makes the case that imams who have immigrated to Canada from more conservative parts of the Muslim world are changing the face of Canadian Islam, in particular by forbidding women from praying in the same hall as men. And so the idea for Little Mosque grew out of this documentary. So she explains, I started thinking we could solve this problem if we had imams that were trained in Canada that were not trained overseas. What would happen to a mosque community if the imam was raised here in Canada? I thought it would be fascinating if the imam had had a different job. So we came from a secular world, so we understood how the world operated from a secular background, and then decided to become an imam. So that's where the idea for Little Mosque came from. For those of you who aren't familiar with the show, the very first episode of the show, it takes place, it's a mosque community whose worship space is in the basement of an Anglican church. And so there are multiple fish out of water stories. But in the very first episode, they have this young lawyer turned imam who comes from Toronto and manages to anger everyone in the entire town by being a bit of a chauvinist about how Toronto is great and that Saskatchewan is the Hicks. So that's Sarkanoan, so what motivated her. Westwood Pictures is the production company. The factors influencing Little Moss's executive producers, Mary Darling and Clark Donnelly of Westwood Pictures, were also intrinsic related to identity and extrinsic related to global geopolitics and the Canadian television industry. So if you're not familiar with television production, the real creative power lies with the executive producers, because the executive producers are the ones who find funding for the entire program. And so since they're the ones who are putting the money forward, finding the money, they have the final creative say, more than the director, more than the creator. As with the Noirs, questions of religious identity played an important role in the decision by Darling and Donnelly to produce the show. Darling and Donnelly are Baha'i, and their faith plays a central role in their decisions about which shows to produce. The Baha'i faith is based on the idea that humanity is one single race, and that the day has come. This is from the website of the Baha'i faith. Humanity is one single race, and the day has come for its unification in one global society. The principal challenge facing the peoples of the earth is to accept the fact of their oneness and to assist in the processes of unification. So with respect to Little Moss, Darling explains, there's a Baha'i writing that talks about how through the conflict of differing opinions, a spark of truth will come to light. Sort of in everything we do. We're always sort of looking for the underlying principle that will resonate, because we think that if these fundamental principles are addressed or acknowledged, it brings about a kind of universal attraction to people. And I say that it's proven out in the shows where we really focus down like that. And those shows are consistently broken out. Little Moss was no exception. And really, there we wanted to explore what happens when two faiths are forced together. So you have the mosque inside of the Anglican Church. The underlying thought being the oneness of humanity, the oneness of religion. So in this way, the intrinsic factor of religious identity dovetailed with the extrinsic factor of global geopolitics, especially as such politics affected relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims in North America. But another extrinsic factor related to funding strategies. In the mid-2000s, when West Wind was pitching Little Mosque to the CBC, Darling and Donnelly were keenly aware of the strategies necessary for funding production in Canada. So part of the funding came from fees paid by the CBC to license the program. Part of the funding came from incentive programs in the provinces of Ontario and Saskatchewan. Part of the funding came from a private investor. Part of the funding was $1 million each year they put up with their own money. And then each of those funding sources came with a lot of strings attached that shaped the way the program looks. And shapes the way that the town is portrayed, for instance. And so they put the money up front. They get first distribution rights on it, and then they go out and distribute it. So Little Mosque, they've distributed it internationally to more than 80 countries as of last year, although notably not the United States and not the United Kingdom, which is something that when I spoke with Mary Darling, she thought was significant that these were the two countries where they had not been able to get a network to pick up the show. So the third person I look at is Anton Leo, who was the creative head of CBC television comedy in the mid-2000s. For Anton Leo, extrinsic factors, in particular the CBC's regional and multicultural mandates, outweighed intrinsic factors, that of identity. However, the question of the CBC's regional and multicultural mandates was inflected through and gained relevance from that of identity. Two mandates influenced Leo's decision to take Nawaz's pitch back to the CBC executives. The first was the mandate to reflect Canada and its regions to national and regional audiences while serving the special needs of those regions. This is also written into the 1991 Broadcasting Act. Leo explains that in 2005, when Nawaz and West Wind were developing the idea for Little Mosque, in his words, "I was traveling the country looking for programming that could come from Saskatchewan. It was part of a practice that predated me and one that I embraced when I got to the CBC. I would take a couple of days and I would go across the country and meet as many people as I could in a little tour from time to time during the year. In addition to that, whenever I could go to something like the Banff Television Festival, which is a very large international television festival that takes place in Alberta once a year, I would make sure that the only meetings I took were meetings with people from regional parts of the country as opposed to Toronto, because they were the ones who had less access to the network in Toronto, therefore needed to be served better by my visit. The English language television industry is centered in Toronto. There's sort of a secondary industry in Vancouver, but Saskatchewan doesn't have much of an industry because Regina has 100,000 people. They just don't have, it's rural. So the CBC's mandate to represent Canada's regions was one factor influencing Leo's decision to bring Nuance's pitch back to the CBC. But, he explains, there was far more to it than its prairie location that piqued my interest. There was also the sense that Nuance was telling, in his words, a very contemporary immigrant story that would, indirectly at least, also help the CBC meet its mandate for multicultural programming. And that's how he framed it. He explained that he was a second-generation Canadian and that his family had come from Sicily, and he had witnessed the way that when his family came from Sicily, there was prejudice against them. He saw the same prejudice against Muslims in Canada, and he thought that Canada, as a country made up largely of immigrants, Canadians would be able to relate to that aspect of the story. And oh, by the way, it's Muslim. But that was a secondary consideration. However, the influence of the multicultural mandate was only that, it was only indirect. As Darling explains, when we pitched Little Mosque to Anthony Leo, whether he had, well, of course, as a CBC executive, he had in his mind the impulse of the mandate. Whether we knew about it or not, I don't know. We wanted to do a show and tell some stories we really loved. And Tom didn't say to us, hey, that really fits our mandate beautifully, let's do that. He said, you know what? My parents came straight from Sicily. Here, Darling explains the story I just explained to you. Leo's account echoes Darling's, but he adds a bit more nuance. He thought that Little Mosque had promised because it told a universal story, that of the immigrant experience in a country where everyone, with the exception of First Nations, came originally from someplace else. Multicultural programming, in his view, was programming to which a country of immigrants could relate. Some of the things that I highlight in the book that I'm working on is the way that multiculturalism comes, the way that it's treated, it comes to mask those very aspects of the culture being depicted that would make it multicultural. So it's multicultural in spite of the fact that it has Muslims in the show, because the religious aspect is only somewhat spoken of, and it's frequently subsumed under more universal themes. So to conclude, in the conclusion to covering Islam, Edward Said posits that there are, in his words, two necessary conditions for knowing another culture: uncoercive contact with an alien culture through real exchange, and self-consciousness about the interpretive project itself. Little Mosque is an example where, to a greater degree than in any North American television show, such contact and self-consciousness have largely prevailed. Now, to be sure, Little Mosque did not escape the trap of generalizations completely. One critic wrote that, in her observation, all of the town's Muslims seem to practice the same way. However, as one member of a Muslim focus group asked another when the CBC was pre-testing the show, do you want to see this on your television show? Or is all you want to see every night, they bombed this, they bombed that, they bombed the other thing? Maybe it's not perfect. Maybe they don't show the prayers exactly how they're supposed to be, but they're showing Muslims as human beings working with other Canadians. So one key to understanding Little Mosque's successes and shortcomings will be the historical circumstances of its genesis. This is not to say that the show necessarily operated as its creators intended, or that its viewers took from it what its creators hoped. Instead, understanding its genesis will help us identify the conditions that had to align in order for the show to be conceivable. Accounts of its genesis have so far focused on a mandate that played only a secondary role. If we shift our attention to the factors that the show's creators identified as important, we can also shift our attention to the questions that we ask about Little Mosque's broader impact. Instead of asking, did Little Mosque present authentic representations of Islam, we can ask, how did the people involved in Little Mosque's production shape the program in reaction to the issues that they saw as salient? Such questions will help scholars move past debates about authenticity, which have characterized the discussion about Little Mosque as a text, to a broader discussion of the many points of contingency, the many small decisions that affect the show, that are involved in the production of North American television about Muslims. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Professor Schamiloglu from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the title of his talk will be The Mevlid Tradition Among the Muslim Turks in the Middle East and Central Eurasia, from its origins to modern times.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank Mustafa Gokcek and his colleagues who organized this conference, and the Niagara Foundation for sponsoring it, and Mehmet Ertem for helping me set up the technology, because as I like to say, those who live by technology die by technology. And this is a rather, for me, a relatively technology-rich presentation. Again, in thanking Mustafa and his colleagues in the Niagara Foundation, I just want to say that it's been an honor for the Middle East Studies program to be a co-sponsor for it. It's also been very easy to be a co-sponsor for it. Okay, so because I'm going to try to get through in 15 minutes, and hopefully he won't boo me off the stage if it goes to 20 minutes, I'm going to summarize or go just through a few bullet points of the first part of the paper. And so this is about the celebration of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, which has been an extremely important religious celebration among Muslims. It's not just a local phenomenon, it's a global Islamic phenomenon, though not all Muslims would be excited about this as a form of religious practice. And so there's an awful lot of that in the introduction, and I'm just going to have to skip over that. So I'm going to just summarize very briefly what I'd like to offer as background for the Arabic language tradition for the celebration of the birthday of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. And this is based largely on the work of N. Kapstein, Muhammad's Birthday Festival, Early History in the Central Islamic Lands, Boaz Shoshan's Popular Culture in Medieval Cairo, which is a really fun book to read, and most recently Marian Katz's The Birth of the Prophet Muhammad, Devotional Piety in Sunni Islam. And so basically the tradition of the Arabic language, the original celebration of the Mawlid, goes back to the Fatimid era, the Shiite dynasty in Egypt. Originally it was celebrated on 12 Rabi' al-Awwal. It may have been celebrated on other dates as well. At the beginning it was connected with the local dynasties' attempt to emphasize its links to the family of the Prophet Muhammad. Later on, this was adopted by Sunni rulers as well. For example, the Syrian ruler Nuruddin in the 12th century. You also have later on, you learn about, for example, the gates of the holy places being opened in connection with the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. And finally, we learn of the elaborate celebrations in Birbil during the reign of Muzaffar ad-Din Kutburi at the beginning of the 13th century. And eventually, we learn that from Shoshan that there's various works of the Seerah tradition that are written. They become very, very controversial. They are also used to celebrate the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. And eventually, this is also affiliated, somehow connected with the celebration of saints' lives as well. And so I'd like to, that's just a few bullet points, and I'm sorry that I can't go over that in detail. What I'd like to focus on is the rise of the Mevlid tradition in the Ottoman Empire, and then the modern Mevlid tradition. And if I have time at the end, I'd like to offer a few thoughts about this as a problem for understanding the history of Islam and popular Islamic practice in Central Eurasia because of my own personal background. And if I have time, I'll say one or two words about that. So, am I better off with glasses or without glasses? Yeah, maybe without glasses. So the rise of the Turkish Mevlid tradition. So the Turkish Mevlid, or in Turkish also Mevlud, tradition originated in Bursa, the first capital of the Ottoman Empire, and dates to the beginning of the 15th century. The earliest representative of the tradition was the Mevlid section in Ahmedi's Iskendername. The Mevlid section was added by Ahmedi to his Iskendername around 1407, following a visit to Bursa around 1400 by a sheikh from Damascus, who had himself authored a Mawlid in Arabic. According to Sawyer, this sheikh, who had caused a great controversy over the place of the Prophet Muhammad among the other prophets, was probably the aforementioned, not for you, Muhammad ibn al-Jazari, who died in 1429, connected with the Damascus school. There were many, many Arabic Mawlid texts. And so that he was an author of Al-Mawlid al-Kabir and other works. But according to the scholar who has worked on Ahmedi's work, it's not clear what the sources of Ahmedi's work is. And Sawyer considers that the Mevlid in Ahmedi's Iskendername is more about the story of the night ascension of the Prophet Muhammad. What would later become the single most important Mevlid text in the Turkish tradition, the Vesilet-ül Necat of Süleyman Çelebi, who died in 1424, was penned in the Ottoman capital city of Bursa approximately 2 years after Ahmedi's Mevlid, so that's circa 1409. In contrast to the Arabic Mevlid tradition, which does not have a single dominant text, Süleyman Çelebi's Mevlid is the classic text in the Turkish Mevlid tradition and was therefore widely copied owing to its immense popularity. For this reason, as noted by Dedes in his detailed study, there is tremendous difficulty in even reconstructing the original text of this work, which later developed more than one version. There are shorter versions, longer versions, the older tradition, the newer tradition. Following his analysis, we may say that all versions of Süleyman Çelebi's Mevlid have the same key sections as follows: the invocation, Munajat, including a prayer dua for the poet, the creation of the spirit, ruh, of the Prophet Muhammad, and the transmission of his light, or nur. The birth of the Prophet Muhammad, including a greetings or merhaba section, the miracles of the Prophet Muhammad, the night ascension to heaven, or miraj of the Prophet Muhammad, the attributes of the Prophet Muhammad, the death of the Prophet Muhammad, the final petition for repentance and forgiveness, hatimeh, and there's also a Mevlid prayer, which is not included in scholarly editions. This is the first time, I think, in my career as a Turkologist and historian, where there's such a multiplicity of texts. There's sections that are read differently by men and women, and there's sections of the work that aren't even in printed editions. I could not go into a detailed discussion of Süleyman Çelebi's Mevlid in this essay. For this, I refer the reader to the masterful essay by Dedes and the work of the other scholars he cites. I would, however, like to consider the question of how and why Süleyman Çelebi's work became so popular in the first place. Dedes cites Şinasi Tekin's theory that the transfer of merit prayer found at the end of the Mevlid is similar to a prayer found in Buddhist Uyghur manuscripts. He just uses this as a takeoff point. Following Tapper and Tapper, whose work I'll come back to later, Dedes further describes the role Mevlid services played in religious life as parallel to the central role of Christ's death and resurrection in the Sunday liturgy, and especially at Easter, basing this on close interaction between Turks and their Christian neighbors. Dedes poses what I consider to be the critical question as follows. As a recent anthropological study, so Tapper and Tapper 1987, put it, they both represent alternative paths to salvation after death and deliverance from sin, a central concern of every believer. It can be no accident that the title of Süleyman Çelebi's Mevlid composition is Vesilet-ül Necat, Path to Salvation. We need to consider to what extent we can reconstruct the history of the Mevlid as a ritual with a performance and textual aspect, and determine its different functions, especially when it came to be associated with death, rather than being just a celebration of the Prophet's birthday. While I agree completely with the question as Dedes has framed it, I take a very different approach to answering the question. As I have argued elsewhere, the 14th century was notable for the great historical phenomenon of the Black Death, the great pandemic of bubonic plague, which originated in China and spread across Central Eurasia. The Black Death reached the Crimea in 1346 and then passed through Constantinople and Anatolia. I'm not going to give you all the details. I write about it. I could talk about it for an hour, but I won't. After reaching Alexandria and Sicily, it spread throughout the Middle East and Europe, where it wreaked havoc among the population. In assessing the impact of the Black Death, I have made the point that Süleyman Çelebi's Mevlid fits the pattern, as in Europe and elsewhere in Central Eurasia in this period, of a work reflecting increased religiosity out of fear of the punishment from God. Not only does this reflect a fascination with morbidity, it is appealing to its audience for offering healing and salvation during a time of death, as evidenced by the refrain, "Ger dilersiz bulasız otlar necat, aşk ile dert ile eğitine sevap." It'll be translated later. Even the Prophet Muhammad in this work is given the epithet of tabib, or healer, which, as far as I am aware, is an innovation in the Islamic tradition, and I'm working on a different study, which is an analysis of this kind of data evidence in this text. Finally, the simpler language of Süleyman Çelebi's vernacular Mevlid, in the words of the great Ottoman traveler Evliya Çelebi, its unparalleled simplicity as a magical poem, no doubt also contributed to its universal popularity and subsequent history of translation into other languages in the Ottoman Empire. I hope to expand on this theme in my future research on Süleyman Çelebi's Vesilet-ül Necat. So now I'd like to come to the Mevlid tradition in the Ottoman Empire. Whereas it is possible to date the rise of the Turkish Mevlid tradition precisely to the first decade of the 15th century, there is only fragmentary evidence for understanding the history of what purposes Mevlid recitation served and on what occasions it was recited. Dedes examines the sources for the Mevlid celebrations in the Ottoman Empire. Apparently, the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad was introduced at the Ottoman court by Sultan Murad III in 1588 or so. Before its introduction at the court, there are only references in poems, and I can skip over that. In the late 18th century, Muracit Oson gives, in the work published in 1787, gives a remarkable detailed description of the elaborate celebration of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad involving, this is the actual text we have in the special collections here. In the late 18th century, he gives this description involving 3 imams, muezzins, 15 singers chanting hymns. This was followed by 3 reciters of the Mevlid reciting until the moment of the birth of the Prophet, after which there is a whole separate ceremony for receiving the annual letter from the Sharif of Mecca, safeguarding pilgrims, accompanied by the serving of sherbet and sweets. Although we cannot be sure whose Mevlid was recited, the most popular one was that of Süleyman Çelebi. As Dedes note, not much is known about the other occasions on which the Mevlid might have been recited beyond its presumed but undocumented association with the 5 sacred nights associated with the Kandil Geceleri, or festival feasts, namely the Mevlid Kandili, so commemorating the Prophet Muhammad's birth, Regaib Kandili, his conception, Kadir Gecesi, so the commencement of the revelation of the word of God to the Prophet Muhammad, and Berat Kandili, which is a night on which all Muslims seeking forgiveness will be forgiven. And while the celebration of the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad became an official holiday in the Ottoman state in 1910, according to Dedes, we apparently do not have accounts of recitations of the Mevlid poem outside of mosques until the turn of the century, citing the notes of Abdulaziz Bey and Halide Edip's novel Sinek-i Bakal. So surprisingly, Halide Edip is a significant source for the Mevlid and how it's used. So I'd like to turn now to the Mevlid tradition in contemporary Turkey. The Mevlid tradition in contemporary Turkey can be discussed at a level of detail impossible to achieve before the 20th century. One of the basic contributions on this topic is Nancy Tapper and Richard Tapper's study of the Mevlid tradition in Eğirdir, Turkey. As they note with regard to how the recitation of the Mevlid has expanded beyond the celebration of just the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, quote, the poem is no longer associated only with the anniversary of Muhammad's birth. Rather, recitals have become the central part of a religious service that may be held at any time of the year and in many different social contexts. Indeed, Mevlid recitals are among the most prominent of all religious services in contemporary Turkey. They are also the focal ritual in what might be called the cult of the Prophet Muhammad, which in many ways qualifies, if not dominates, popular Turkish Islam. So as discussed by Tapper, Dedes and various other authors, the Mevlid has come to occupy a central place in what they refer to as popular Turkish Islam. In the town of Eğirdir, the Mevlid performances are a very important part of practical religious observance, but there are substantial differences in the attitudes of men versus women concerning the Mevlid tradition. The men of the community lean towards the more official stance that the poem is beautiful but unimportant because it is not Quranic, only an occasion for the recitation of the Quran. On the other hand, the women of the community consider that the rituals and singing of hymns are evidence of greater religiosity on their part. How much am I doing on time? Do I have 10 minutes? 5 minutes. Oh boy. So, okay. So there's all kinds of categories in which the Mevlid is celebrated. One is connected with funerals, another is joyful occasions like circumcision, or marriage, and the third is to secure God's blessing for the principals and their families. Tapper and Tapper continue with an extraordinary discussion of just how Mevlid celebrations after Friday gatherings by women differ from the celebration by men. So in the description of Tapper and I'm hopping, skipping, and jumping, the sentiments of this and other hymns which are sung are simple and positives. Worshippers may cleanse their hearts and turn to God. Happy images drawn widely from the Islamic tradition express nearness to God and hopes for salvation. There are many ways in which the celebration of women after the Friday weekly prayer gatherings works. So first of all, they begin with a different couplet. Because even the reading begins with something totally different, and I'm not even sure if that's in the published text. They also convert the standard refrain, which refers to hellfire, which I quoted in Turkish earlier. If from hell's flame you hope to find salvation, with grief and love repeat the salutation, they change it to a much more positive injunction. If you seek to find the sublime place, lovingly repeat the salutation. They describe the birth of the Prophet Muhammad in the most elaborate fashion, and so I'll read a paragraph and then I'll turn to some audiovisual clips. As the time of the birth approaches, Émilie cries out the thirst and is offered sweet ice-cold water, which fills her with light and joy. At recitals commemorating a very recent death, tall glasses of sugar water or very sweet lemonade, Jannat Sherbatit, so literally heavenly cordial, are then given to the congregation, though on other occasions for both men and women, packages of sweets may be distributed. Then at the moment of the birth of the prophet, in the poem, when the white bird comes and strokes Emine's back, all the women stand facing Mecca while the cantor sprinkles rose water over them. The women then imitate both Amina and the white bird. They are in any case covered with waist-length diaphanous white prayer scars, and now they move through the room, stroking each other on the back. When the flurry of movement and contact is over, women return to their places and the cantor recites the standard prayer, Ayakduasa, a prayer for the intercession of the Prophet in the lives of the congregation, which links images of birth with Muhammad's life journey to heaven. And so Tucker and Tapper also give a description of how this is a very, very special thing for regarding equality of women, equating women, a unity of women through the process of birth and motherhood, and so on. Now, I just wanted to say that, and this is the technology issue, so, you know, the Mevlid celebration is very, very popular. It's still an ongoing tradition, even though they were talking about how as Turkish Islam becomes more mosque-centered, there is certain changes in the transformation. Tulumba.com, you can buy Ismail Bulbul, you can buy from Kani Karaca. And what I'm going to do now is just play, maybe just a clip for Kani Karaca. I hope that's the one. Let's see if we can do this. So you need to hear this, and then I want to show a few images for a few minutes, and then I promise to be good. Tulumba.com, so it's like going to Barnes and Noble and listening to a track. So, okay, now what I'd like to do is just spend several more minutes, if Mustafa and my colleagues will indulge me, to show you a couple of other things. There's three, very briefly, I'm interested in this tradition. As a budding Turkologist, I studied the history of Turkish and Turkic literatures and all kinds of things. Where did this come from? Okay, Sidi Manchedi, so I knew that name as a student. Later, more recently, as a scholar, among other things, of the Black Death, I suddenly realized that, oh my God, this is a vernacular text reflecting increased religious devotion, and that's in part my argument for why this was adopted into the Turkish tradition. The other thing is, as somebody of Kazan Tatar origin, a good Muslim boy from the Bronx, I grew up hearing Mevlid or Mevlid and Tatar celebrations in New York City, in Queens, New York. And so for Tatars, you know, here, the Quran was important. You had vernacular texts like Tales of the Prophets, the Qasas al-Anbiya, and so on. I'm thinking back, I have no idea what version of the Mevlid was read in New York. I suspect it might have been the Tokyo version, because there was a Tatar diaspora all around, including Tokyo. And this might be one. This one I think is inspired or partially built upon Süleyman Çelebi's work. On the other hand, there was a dissertation on that I had a chance to order. You can now get dissertations from Russia Life and Progress. That's amazing. You have to use Western Union money, right? And so there's another tradition to the Mevlid al-Nabi, which was this particular one. This was shared with me by a colleague from Kazan, and this was not studied in Shamsuddin Nabi's dissertation. And so really, I don't have background on this, and I need to study this. But all I wanted to say is just show a few images and just offer one or two final thoughts. So Mevlid al-Nabi bayramı hakkında bir iki söz. So Peygamberimiz Muhammed Resulullah sallallahu aleyhi ve sellem Hazretlerinin Tuhan gününü aynen açık kutlu etmek. So this is for saying, this is an introductory essay by the head of a famous madrasa in Kazan, who's basically explaining that this is a feast where you should be feeding the poor, and that goes back to the kinds of things I skipped over in reading my talk about in medieval times, in the Ottoman Empire, how you had festivals and feeding people, and so on. Here we have the something about kind of the signs of the Prophet, okay? And here we have Türki Mevlid al-Nabi Kasidesi. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So, evvela ben bir hikaye edeyim. Okay, so here Ehli Ahbar'dan rivayet edeyim. So here we have an adaptation of the poem. I'm actually not sure what the source of this is. That suddenly, after getting this material, I realized, oh my God, it's not the same as Süleyman Çelebi. I'm having trouble figuring out what it's related to. So it seems that this is a separate tradition. This is a tradition that includes references that you're supposed to do this in a certain Istanbuli makam. And finally, here it says Mahali Qiyam. So, and when the Prophet Muhammad, at the moment where he's born, everybody's supposed to stand up. Now, so what we see here is, I think, a high tradition, an intellectually, academically, Islamically informed tradition. I think this other tradition, the Tokyo tradition, reflects a more popular tradition. So it seems that there was like a more popular version that was much simpler, and there was another tradition that was sponsored by or supported by the ulama. We don't really know if this tradition began in the 19th century or earlier or what. And so you heard before, this is my last thing. So you heard before the chanting of Kami Karaja. And so what I grew up hearing sounded much more like this, and I have to boost this up, because you're not going to hear it. And so this is the tradition. This is closer to like a zikr from Uzbekistan. What I learned about the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, I'm taking as a framework for this research in progress to try to reconstruct some aspects of the Mevlid tradition in Central Eurasia, which otherwise is off the radar screen, and knowledge about that can be completely lost. So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Émilie Roy. I said it wrong, sorry. He's a graduate student and sessional lecturer from McMaster University, Hamilton, Ontario. And the title of her speech is Modern Muslim Citizens, Malian Muslims Responding to the Challenge of the Secular State.
So my paper today is based on 2 years of field research in Bamako, Mali. And if you've watched the news recently, you will know that the situation is evolving quickly. So even the abstract that I wrote for this paper doesn't quite apply anymore, insofar as Mali is not a democratic state anymore, as of 3 weeks ago. Nevertheless, I want to argue that my conclusion that Arabisans in Mali still share in the democratic sentiment, and they still uphold the values of the democratic state in Mali. The Arabisans, which I will be talking about, were not part and were not involved in the coup d'etat that happened 3 weeks ago. And they are not part of the Northern Rebellion, whether as part of the Tuareg Rebellion or the Ansar-Din or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So the group I'm focusing on is representative only of Bamako itself, being very far from Timbuktu and the north, where most of the events are happening. We're talking about 3,000 kilometers away. So whatever I say about Southern Arabisans in Mali should not be taken for granted as applying to Northern Mali. So the local histories and politics of power and power relations in Mali greatly influence the development of a rationalized, local, yet standardized understanding of Islamic knowledge in médersas. And I'm going to use the French word médersa because they refer to a particular type of school in Mali which teach both secular curriculum and religious curriculum side by side. I won't use the word madrasa because locally, madrasa, the word madrasa in its Arabic version is used to refer to all types of schools. The French version is used to is used specifically for the schools I'm talking about that combine both curriculum. So the creation of madrasas, private schools that teach both a secular and a religious curriculum, and in which the language of instruction is Arabic, is symptomatic of the changes and adaptation made to understanding of Islamic knowledge in the past 50 years in Mali. The various confrontations between the government of Mali and the constituencies of the Médersa, which I call the Arabisans, regarding the official curriculum and examinations to be imposed on Médersa students, created a local understanding of Islamic knowledge and in turn participated in the development of a new Islamic mentality in Mali, one that is this-worldly oriented, activist, yet not political per se, and focus on rendering daily life morally pure. The standardized version of Islam is referred to as mondain, which means this-worldly oriented. I use the term mondain because it has been used in other literature, especially about Egypt. Yet this is not particular to Mali and clearly participates in the larger debate within the Muslim world about the relation between piety, modernity, globalization, and democracy. Islam mondain, as it is found in Mali, leads me to argue that Southern Malian Arabisans should not be assumed as being or having the potential to be Muslim extremists based on their shared characteristics with extremist groups, like poverty, unemployment, and a series of other classical traits attributed to Muslim extremists. As most Muslim worldwide, Southern Malians Arabisans have simple goals which are chiefly worldly: employment, some material comfort, marriage, love, etc. The concept of citizenship into the modern secular state that is Mali is not called into question, and most young Southern Arabisans do support the democratic system and its values. The democratic sentiment of Southern Malian Arabisans is as strong as ever, and I would add, though more information needs to be gathered in light of the recent events from the people in Bamako, that sentiment sentiment remains despite the recent political events. The few people I have managed to contact on the phone usually do not support the military coup that just happened. However, this is not to say that Southern Malians are not engaged in social activism, but rather that their activism is specific to their needs as Southern Malians and not constructed along the lines of global Islam and for the implementation of Sharia law. Southern Malians are critical of and disappointed with the leader of their states and the collective well-being of Malians, and that's where their activism takes place. This discontent has been made clear by the military coup of March 21st, as well as the rebellion of the Mouvement National de Libération de la Sahara, which is the Tuareg rebellion up north, and the activities of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb or the Ansar-Din. However, I believe that the democratic sentiment of the Southern Arabs of Mali will not decrease and might in fact increase following the recent event and the chaos that it created within the country. If McMaster have failed to provide their graduates with actual job opportunities, they have succeeded in creating, occupying, and controlling a social and political sphere by creating a valued social status, offering a certain amount of upward social mobility that students of Quranic schools, for example, never enjoy. The widening of the public discourse by Muslims and about Islam in Mali is closely linked to the increasing number of educated Muslims in the country, as well as the general liberalization process that followed the fall of Mustafa's dictatorship. In a quasi-circular fashion, the exponential growth of the McMaster system is also systematic of the general trend for Muslim voices to be ever more present in the Malian public sphere. One feeds on the other. The bigger the group, the more influential the group becomes, which in turn attracts more people to the group. The process of integration of the McMaster into the state's educational system started in the 1980s and is still at work today. And it can be seen as a victory by the McMaster constituencies who, after decades of operating on the margins of the social sphere, have successfully imposed their presence upon Malian society and the Malian state. Conversely, the integration process can also be seen as a victory for the state, which appropriated for itself a functional system of education in the development of which it has not invested any of its own resources. The sometimes conflictual development of the official curriculum of the McMaster can be seen as a step in a process of standardization and rationalization of Islamic knowledge, but a step that led Islamic education to be relevant to the contemporary social political context. The very idea of teaching religious classes alongside secular ones, the sometimes forcible imposition of a national curriculum for McMasters during the 1980s and 1990s, and the push by both the government and the McMaster entrepreneurs to make Islamic schooling available to an ever wider public has led to the standardization and rationalization of religious knowledge. The rationalization process I discussed here refers to the change in both the method and the content of Islamic teaching, the disappearance of esoteric concepts, and the gaining by the intellect of knowledge rather than by mimesis. I refer here to, it also refers to the ever greater integration of the McMaster school system into the contemporary political economy, financially, pedagogically, socially, and even politically. The creation of the Islamic McMasters in the 1950s was a paradigm shift and an epistemological rupture in Islamic knowledge and education in West Africa. The esoteric paradigm of the Quranic school emphasized Islamic knowledge as sacred, that it must be comprehended by the intellect after a lengthy devotional practice, and that it is transmitted directly, if secretively, from master to pupil. In the rationalist paradigm, Islamic knowledge is no longer considered secret, and revelation and the divine law are equally accessible to all. Religious devotion is dissociated from the pedagogical means of teaching and divine intervention plays no role in the intellectual development of the students. Islamic knowledge has also changed significantly through the improvement of teaching methods for Arabic in the Madessas. This was a deliberate goal of the first founders of Islamic Madessas, which had significant implication. A faster and better understanding of Arabic also meant that students of Madessas, as compared to students from Quranic schools, had a better understanding of the sources for Islamic knowledge, and that in turn required the masters to develop modernized pedagogical tools for religious education. These pedagogical changes in teaching Arabic and Islamic studies were also accompanied by a conceptual change in the place of Islamic knowledge alongside other sorts of knowledge. In a modern Malian Islamic Madrasa, religious courses are some amongst many other courses taken by students in their very busy schedule. Religious knowledge becomes just another topic. The pressures of the rationalization of knowledge and religion in Malian society is both a product and a cause of the changes in the organization of education, and although the founders of Madrasa claim to be opposed to it, the official secularism of the government and the rationalization of knowledge are largely responsible for the dynamism of Islamic schooling, which itself has many secular characteristics. Madrasas are constantly appropriating the material of modernity and subsequently reinventing modernity. This new form of Islamic education, rooted in secular pedagogy and courses, has created an educational system to address both the educational needs of a modernizing society, as well as guard against its perceived moral decay. This is akin to Lucan's Bull's observation of the conceptualization of modernity as developed in Indonesia. Modern Islamic schools are not just translating modernity for a Muslim audience. They are in the process of imagining modernity as dangerous because it is a factor of globalization, as well as a factor for the loss of traditional value. But they are also constructing an imagined modernity that is malleable and subject to reinvention, which they propose to inject with Islamic values, whatever they consider Islamic value. In this way, I argue that the actors of the Islamic schooling system are reinventing their tradition, which they conceive as compatible with modernity, to create a new mentality, which I have called Islam modern. According to Hirschkin, the modern public sphere of Islam has both a deliberative aspect and a disciplinary function. The deliberative aspect emphasizes the possibility of argument, contestation, and dialogue that have been afforded by the advent of universal modern literacy, the diffusion of printed text, and the operation of electronic mass media. The disciplinary function of the public sphere of Muslim-majority society are clearly observable in the expansion of the media technology, bringing about a concomitant expansion of authoritative religious discourse, leading to subjection of this authority and a uniformization of the model of moral behavior. Hirschkin posits that both approaches, the deliberative and the disciplinary, are relevant to the study of the public sphere in Muslim-majority societies, insofar as the authoritative discourse of religious leaders about Muslim value creates the ethical condition for a domain of public deliberation and argumentation. However, this is accompanied by a pluralization of religious authority. It widens the debate over the social meaning of Islam, as well as diversifying the group of people who can claim to define the role of Islam. This diversification of authoritative sources also implies some erosion of traditional authority. Traditional scholarly elites have become marginalized or bypassed completely by pious non-Muslims, who now have direct access to Islamic knowledge, both via the Madrasa and the wider accessibility of Islamic literature. The standardization of religiosity and the uniformization of practices are consequences of the expanded public sphere in Mali and the widening of the debate about Islam, insofar as it fostered a shared, conventional Muslim identity, purged of its particularistic traits. This process can clearly be seen in action within the Islamic educational system in Mali. The rationalization of knowledge and the adaptation of curriculum to the demand of modern society happened in Bamako's McMaster as well as in the larger Muslim public sphere. McMaster, as educational establishment attended by an ever greater number of Malians, are a prime institution for social and religious mediation, insofar as they have prepared successive generations of youth to enter the public sphere. McMasters in Mali are giving local youth the tools to debate and question, as well as the limit and the format of this questioning, the challenges posed by contemporary conditions in Mali, and to speak and to act as Muslims in the public arena. The ways these particular, Muslims present themselves in the social sphere shall not be discussed. Islam Mondain is a useful conceptualization of the changes in religious practice taking place within segments of the Malian population. It emphasizes the disciplining power of ethical speech. Suarez and Osella define Islam Mondain as the complex way of being Muslim in the contemporary world in which Muslims reflect upon being Muslims, about politics, morality, family, consumption, employment, media, entertainment, and so forth. Islam Mondain does not privilege Islam over anything else, emphasizing instead the actual world in which Muslims find themselves. Lucan's Bull has clearly explained how one of the key issues in modern Islamic education is the idea that both tradition and modernity can and are being reimagined and reinvented, and that one cannot be conceptualized as such without the other. Modernity has to be imagined as subject to traditional morality, which in turn needs to be reinvented to suit the present needs as a buffer and a temper to modernity. Both modernity and tradition are negotiated in terms of each other. Islam Mondain offers a model of virtuous socio-economic comfort and an Islamization of the benefits of globalization and modernization, which renders them morally pure. It is the moralization of daily life for people disenchanted by the failures of the state and moving away from the religio-political ideal, although not setting aside all activism, as I said, to focus on self-improvement and the correct practice of Islam within the current political and economic circumstances in which they find themselves. One of the key examples of that is the display of cool fashion accessories, often emphasizing the monetary ease that may or may not be there in reality. And it's one of the key ways in which young Muslims in Mali participate in the global youth culture. If it can sometimes be judged harshly as superficial and untraditional by traditional Muslim authority in Mali, it is internally justified within the Arabistan community when coupled with the obvious piety, disposition, and knowledge of religious duty. One is morally justified to display one's riches as long as it is complementary to the moral order upheld by a pious Muslim in his everyday life. In the case of Mali and Arabistan, although few of them can be considered very rich, though there are a few exceptions, this new approach to worldly possession legitimizes, in Islamic terms, the desires of Southern Malians youth to participate fully in the material benefit of the modern world without jeopardizing their morality. I have seen this at work many times in Medessas in Bamako. I have seen this especially in terms of the cool dress codes for boys and the ubiquitous fancy cell phones that everyone are very proud to display. There was no end to comments about my lack of a fancy cell phone. It was terrible. Medesta students, and often teachers as well, are closely attuned to fashion trends promoted by American hip-hop stars. Baggy pants and baseball caps are common sights in classrooms and prayer halls, while steel-toed Timberland boots are lined up at the entry of mosques. One such example is a man called Zakaria Kansai, who's in his late 30s and is the owner of one of the biggest madrasa and most renowned madrasa in Bamako, who came to some interviews sporting said Timberland boots and a puffy jacket, and he would have fit right in any inner city in North America. And this is not seen as being in contradiction with any form of piety at the individual level. The desire to participate in the worldwide trendy, technology-savvy youth culture is by no means considered by most as in contradiction with the proper behavior and disposition of a pious Muslim. In the early years of the millennium, Mali was held to be one of the only Muslim-majority countries sustaining a free democracy. Now, as of 3 weeks ago, not so much the case. And Freedom House has come to the conclusion, after surveying a 47 Muslim-majority country, that Mali was the one that qualified as free. And indeed, the Arabisans, like Southern Malians in general, are proud of their democratic credentials and have used them to their advantage in the world scene to obtain international aid. Malians have made the most of their dependence on foreign aid by managing and manipulating their aid donor, a complex and fluctuating congregation of foreigners headed by the World Bank. Malians are quite aware of that the donors are not about to abandon democratic Mali, especially with conflicts raging in the surrounding countries. As one Malian academic once said, for us, and I quote, for us, democracy is as good as money in the bank. Southern Malian Arabisans are just as aware of this situation as other Malians and play it to their advantage. In order to attract money from Western democracies, Medesta constituencies play out their support for democracy. They have succeeded sufficiently in this endeavor to attract funding from Italian, Turkish, Canadian, and American NGOs and government-sponsored organizations. Southern Malians tend to prefer the liberty of choice in matter of religion. They tend to support the government that offers the possibility of being a good Muslim without actually enforcing it. Despite these criticisms, the post-colonial state that Malians have, it is striking that most Malian religious leaders and ordinary Muslims are not usually calling for the implementation of any form of religious law. Although these leaders might themselves use Islamic principle to regulate their own affairs in private, they will never ask for it at the state level. And I'm going to have to cut short here. So the Ahmadzah Southern Mali are clearly part of the civil Islam movements insofar as they are not challengers of the democratic political structure, but rather are supporters of its continuation and improvement, although they make their point in often religious terms. Malian Ahmadzah, like other Malians, are active participants in the modernization of the country and the modern political culture of Mali. The Medesta themselves, through their curriculum, transmit modern knowledge, if only in science, and by a modern pedagogical tool. While Southern Malians, Ahmadzah, are modern, they are also wary of too much modernity in the form of excessive secularization imposed and financed by Western countries and NGOs. Their choice, or the choice for the Ahmadzah, is never between modernity and Islam, but rather between an Islamized modernity and a Westernized modernity. In the words of Suarez and Asela, and I quote, Muslims produce for themselves modern in everyday life and have moved to provincialize Western modernity. They are creating their own form of secular modernity that adapts itself to their Muslim values. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we have about 12 minutes for questions and answers. So again, we can get a set of questions there are any? Yes, thank you.
So I would like to ask a question about Mali. When we look at Western African cases with the Muslim majority populations, we see that in Senegal, Mali, and Niger, despite some groups and civil wars recently, the democracy scores are very high. So how can we explain the difference between, let's say, Senegal, Mali, Niger with Algeria and Tunisia? Because if it was French colonial legacy, as Professor Gokcek referred to, both sides, African and North African sides, are French colonies. But why do we see, let's say, more passive secularist, tolerant way in Senegal, Mali, Niger, and more restrictive sectors in Algeria, Tunisia? But if we focus on your issue, democracy, modernity, why do we see more cohabitation between Islam and democratic values in Mali, maybe in neighborhoods, Senegal, Niger, in comparison to the conflicts in Algeria?
Any other questions that we could get at this point?
My question is to Émilie. Can you see what transformations was made to Mali and in comparison to what were in history, maybe the rituals, the time,
Where?
among the Turks?
Other questions? Let me take the liberty to ask a question myself to Professor Conway. You mentioned that the United States and Britain, they couldn't find a cable channel to host the show. Did they mention the reasons for that?
Thank you for the question. When I spoke with a number of people. I spoke with the executive producers. I spoke with the creator of the program. I spoke with a number of writers, and all of them related the same story to me, and they all experienced it differently. First of all, they all began their interviews. They said, "Oh, last week when I was in Los Angeles, every single one to a person had to point out that they had just been in LA. I actually don't care, but they wanted me to know that." So they said, last week when I was in Los Angeles, we're trying to syndicate Little Moscow Prairie, and I would describe the idea to the network executive, and the executive would say, "This is great. I think this is a wonderful show. This is something we need to show, but Americans won't watch it." And the thought was that Americans are still too suspicious of Muslims in general. So if you look at, there was the reality show on TLC, American Muslim, I think was the name of it. It was a reality show about a community.
All American.
Thank you.
Muslim, yeah.
So All American Muslim, and it's a really interesting show, and I enjoyed watching it. But there was the controversy when a very conservative Christian organization said that this show was propagandistic, and because of that, they were going to boycott Lowe's because Lowe's was buying advertising time, and so Lowe's pulled their ads from that program. And so this idea that American viewers weren't ready for it, I don't know. I think most American viewers are ready for it, but there are some very vocal conservative voices who had a disproportionate effect on television in the United States.
Humorless conservative voices.
Yes, humorless conservative voices.
Okay. No, we can go.
thank you for your question. I'll really try to be brief. Some of the points would have been answered if I gave you the full version of the paper. So just very, very briefly. So the problem is that our data, the information we have that scholars are aware of, is very limited. So for example, the account of Dosson for 1787 is detailed, but until around the beginning of the 20th century, we don't even know to what extent the method was really performed outside of the mosque. We don't really know if it was done for those 5 kandil or candle feasts. That's also something that's known in the Ottoman Empire, but I never heard of that until much later. And so that's one of the issues. In the 20th century, Tapper and Tapper talk about how perhaps it's becoming a little bit less important. You have to broadcast nationally on television, and there's an emphasis more on the mosque. And there are people who say that this is bid'ah, and that this really should not be performed. But I think if you look this up on a Google search, you'll find so many websites saying, asking questions about, is the Mawlid celebration okay, or is it bid'ah? It's so widespread that it means that it's really popular. And as I talk to my colleagues and friends who are Turkish, they say, oh yeah, it's still very, very popular. With regard to Central Eurasia, and I'll be very brief there, I cannot say whether this is something that was introduced or became popular. Well, it's with Süleyman Çelebi, it was so popular. It was translated into Balkan languages, all kinds of other languages. So clearly, it was really, really popular. We just don't know how it was used. In the case of Central Eurasia, be it Central Asia, be it the Balkan region, and so on, I don't really know when it was introduced. It's possible it became popular in the 19th century. The first publication of it was by Kazanbek in 1847, I think. But we don't have enough information on how that version, the Süleyman Çelebi version, was used, or this other version that I showed, how it was used. But clearly, if it has introductions by Halimcan Barudi and all kinds of other essays connected with it, and they're saying, Arab ulama say this about it, and that there are instructions to sing it according to this maqam, and instructions that this is where you should stand up. Clearly, there was a tradition that was influenced probably directly from the Middle East by scholars who could read Arabic and so on. But beyond these texts, I have no idea. It may be that there's some travelers who have indications about it, or there might be archival information, which I'm never going to look at. So I can't really say. And that's why, as I said, I'm trying to kind of maybe reconstruct an understanding of this tradition a little bit, because it was the most popular kind of Islamic practice, a text that was second in importance only to the Quran, and I can say we know almost nothing about it.
Thank you for your question. I will answer in 2 parts. There's the Malian response to your question. Malians tend to emphasize their attachment to democracy in terms of both Islamic practice, so they use the quite common apologist definition of shura, saying it is an Islamic version of democracy, so it always existed, so you shouldn't be shocked that Muslim can be Democrat. And they also use the local history, especially the history of Sundiata Keita, to explain consultation practices within the local community, and especially in the Bambara groups. So Sundiata created the Empire of Mali and federated a number of different groups, and all the different chiefs had to pay their respect to him, and you consider that moment where they basically elected Sundiata to be the chief of the bigger empire as some form of democratic precursor in the country. So they will often refer to that. And they will also refer to what they call parenté à plaisanterie, which joking family relationship would be the best translation in English. They have, in Mali, it's very common, every family is linked by that joking relationship to another family, through which conflict resolution is mediated, often through humor, actually. You would probably for example, one family can make fun and in public of the other family, and they're not allowed to take offense at it. They will refer to that usually as one of those institutions where people are granted equality and there's mediating factors. Now, whether the argument they make to relate it to democracy is often shaky, nevertheless, they tend to emphasize that as being part of their democratic background prior to colonization and then independence in 1960. In the second part, and in light of your research in particular, Mali as Niger is highly dependent on international funding for basic services. There is no tax base. The state lives on rents from mostly the World Bank and other international donors, which are mostly Western. But they have no bargaining chip. There's very few resources in Mali. There's a little bit of gold, but not enough that it matters, and pretty much nothing else. And therefore, the countries who make bilateral agreement with Mali or multilateral agreements like the World Bank and other international institutions tend to do it for ideological reasons, like the promotion of democracy. And as I said, Malians are very aware of the fact that it's their best bargaining chip, that as long as they remain a democratic country, people will pour in to help them out. I think it's something that they mentioned before. I've been on the phone a lot with my interviewees in Mali lately, and it's something that they mention regularly, that now all Westerners are pulling out, and that's the thing that's going to hurt the most. It's not the political disturbance, it's not the messing up of the local institution, it's the fact that aid is not going to come in anymore just because of the military coup. So I would say that international aid, in that particular case, has actually helped to maintain democracy in Mali, although not necessarily in the way they want it. Malians use it as a tool. They're not passive recipient. They definitely have agency in that, but it's one of the reasons I would say democracy is working there.
Any other questions? We have a little bit more time for a couple more questions maybe. I hope you won't mind if I take a little bit to answer another question to by Schamiloglu. I'm really fascinated with the subject. This is a great topic to look into. It's a very important tradition, and especially being one of the Turkic traditions, all widespread across Central Asia and Anatolian Balkans. The Ottoman influence, the Sufi influence of the transformation of it in the 19th century maybe, going outside of the mosque. And I remember too, in the houses, when people die or any kind of celebration can be a reason to recite in the book. Even when people do not understand you weren't the only ones who did not really get what they were saying. Even in Turkish, you will not really understand what they are saying most of the time. Partly because it is an Ottoman, and partly because it's just sand in a melodical way. So it is really a fascinating thing to look into. But in what other ways can we find democratic aspects? Of course, we don't mean political democracy in any way, but any kind of cultural consequences or implications of this practice and its transformation over time that might hint at cultural, social, traditional, gender. You mentioned the women taking a role, but if you could just maybe elaborate on that a little bit more.
Well, that's a good question, and I think you're asking as punishment for going over my time. It's a challenging question. I'll try my best to just emphasize several points. I think the first thing is that it's clear that by the time we get to the turn of the 20th century, this is a very, very widespread practice. It's a very, very popular practice. It seems to be outside the control of dominant state institutions. And it even seems that in modern Turkey, where mosques mosque life and religious life is controlled and paid for by the Ministry of Spiritual Affairs, of Religious Affairs. As far as I can tell, this is outside of that. So that, maybe that's what you want to hear. So that seems to be one thing. That seems to be one thing about it. Certainly to the extent that this is one of those texts that might be connected with the spread of the Sufi orders, the Naqshbandi or others. I mean, from what that last clip I played is kind of like, I think like a Naqshbandi zikr or prayer in Central Asia. And the first time I heard that, it blew me away because I said, this is like what I heard when I was growing up. And I totally did not think at that time that, or even as a student, that there was any kind of Sufi influence in Tatar Islam. But that's because people in Kazan didn't know it, and now we're just figuring it out. And a lot of that is kind of like parallel to the state, or underground, or even trying to escape from state control, especially in the case of the Russian Empire, and trying to avoid the control of the Muslim Spiritual Board. And certainly, so to the extent, I mean, I wasn't seeking to have a topic that is, political and emphasizing democracy, but certainly this is, a very, very important kind of popular worship. And to the extent that you think about it in terms of gender roles, as the tablets say too, I was really, really fascinated to read about how basically this was in a way empowering for women. It gave them a chance to have the women who kind of hosted these readings or these recitations. It gave them a chance to have a position of authority or control outside of the household, which may have been male-dominated. It helped create women's networks, and it helped create, as I said, kind of solidarity between women, using this in part as a celebration of empowerment, of birth, giving birth to a child in motherhood. So in terms of what we're talking about as representative democracy or forms of government, no, it's not about that. But in terms of popular forms of worship, popular forms of culture and social organization and networks outside of government control, it does have that aspect to it. And again, just as you said, and as anybody will tell me from Turkey, because I didn't grow up in Turkey, I'm not Turkish, and the way the method was used, it's similar in some ways in terms of funerary celebrations or connected maybe with some other kinds of happy occasions, that really this is like possibly the most important form of communal worship in Turkey. And the idea that very few studies of it exist, and that there are very few studies of it outside of, for areas outside of Turkey, and that this is a global phenomenon, and I can hardly find any study of this as a global phenomenon, suggests that there's still a lot to do there. And I can assure you, I never thought I would be studying this. It's just, I stumbled upon it because of the black.
Thank you very much. And please join me in thanking all the speakers for this wonderful. Our last coffee break, and